So, welcome to this follow-up video to the recent video that I posted about, well-being, essentially, about well-being theory, and the well-being theory in question was Perma, or more accurately, Perma Plus. So, why this video? Well, at the end of the last video, I mentioned optimism, because optimism is closely connected to our well-being, and being pessimistic or optimistic can have, as you may imagine, certain psychological consequences. However, the psychological consequences are not the only thing that is going on. And as, thank goodness, many more of us realize these days, the mind and the body, the brain and the body, the brain and the mind, if they're separate, are all connected, and our psychology can have a huge impact on our physiology. So, if that is true, and I believe it to be the case, of course I'm not the only one, then if we are filled with the sense of well-being, rather than overt happiness swinging from the chandelier, which is fine occasionally if the chandelier is well secured, you're insured, and the landing is soft, then generally speaking, it is, I think, well-being a sense of pleasantness, of being connected very often to people and our surroundings, and to have those things like meaning and purpose, and a sense of making a difference out there overall. That's the well-being aspect that was covered in terms of the Perma Plus model. Now, before we get on to optimism, I should mention that I'm scratching the surface. The video that I made about well-being is, I don't know, 23 minutes long, something like that. And it could easily have been an hour, and it could easily have been several days. It's a huge subject. It's a sprawling area, and it is a really important area. Luckily, there's a lot of research and a lot of people doing research in that area, but I bring it to your attention possibly as a reminder, and if not, as a prompt to have a look at that stuff, because I think it's so important. And you may or may not be aware that the premise of the channel is to share ideas and strategies and tools and ways of being and ways of doing very often that can improve our lot in life. Is any one of them a panacea? No. Put together, are they? Still probably no. Are they likely to improve things for us? I would say yes, indeed they are. So, that being said, the sort of segue now is towards this thing that I've called optimism, because optimism is closely associated with that Perma Plus model, with well-being, and it is in, some people would argue, the same ballpark as good nutrition, sleep, exercise, and I think that is the case. But what the weighting is, who knows? It varies from individual to individual. So what I wanted to do here was to touch on some elements of optimism, some things that it's probably useful for all of us to be aware of. And you may be aware of them already, of course. So this, once more, could act as a reminder or prompt. And this, well, these three different aspects I'm going to look at they are not remotely exhaustive at all. Once more, there's another sprawling area, and it is highly likely that I'll come back and revisit this. But for the moment, just to put this in the mix and add it to that video about well-being, let's begin with something that has been called an attributional style. This can be important in us being more or less optimistic. And I would say that I'm certainly pessimistic from time to time. There are definitely periods where I will go through life and I'm much more pessimistic than optimistic. And I have found that I have been at times also optimistic and gone through periods of time where I'm more optimistic than pessimistic. But the reason for telling you that, because we're all different, is that I've noticed that this attributional style that I'm about to talk to does have a role to play. It is suggested academically, research-wise, that it has a role to play, but also, for what it's worth, I've noticed it as well. So this style is about the locus of control. And some people suggest that if we have an internal locus of control, we're more likely to be optimistic. If we have an external locus of control, we're more likely to be pessimistic. And what do those things mean? Well, I've talked about them before. Maybe you've heard some of those videos, broadcasts, whatever, but we're here to talk about them again in case you missed them or you need this prompt. And a locus of control is in many ways a fancy term to describe where we put responsibility, where we think the things are happening because we've been involved or we think they're happening at random. Let me explain. If you and I have an internal locus of control, then it is likely that we believe we have a high agency in our lives. We have something called causal agency, that we can create our will, the thing that we want, to create. We have the skills and abilities and time, possibly as well, to do that thing, to make that change. And you may think, well, doesn't everyone? And well, perhaps not. But I guess if we then contrast it to an external locus of control, then this may make a little bit more sense. So an external locus of control, if someone is 100% that way, then they believe that everything that happens to them has nothing to do with them, that they are bounced around by the vagaries of the weather, the economic weather, the emotional weather of others, the whims, happenstance, chance, fate, etc. And that they're just like a little cork bobbling down a river, buffeted, moved around by the currents, these energies of those other things. And pretty much everything that happens to them is not within their control. So that's an extreme version to make the point, but there are people who can be like that. And also, I think there are times when certainly I can be like that. And what that means is if we think that way around, then we can say, well, oh, there, this person goes again. Oh, here we go. This always happens to me. And good grief, I may have expected it. In fact, I've been sitting waiting on this to happen. Now, this is another conversation which I'm not going to get into here, otherwise we'll go off in too many different directions, about our beliefs impacting things, about how much we may influence what is happening by that perspective based on simple things like our body language, facial expression, how we approach people. If we approach people thinking, well, there's no point, everything happens to me, I'm unlucky, then we get into that other area that I talked about before in terms of the book, The Luck Factor. And I think that this is part of it, this attributional style of an external locus of control. Everything happens to me. I have no agency in life. And for sure, of course, I believe that all of us can get into that place, may have been in that place, absolutely. And that can create a sense of helplessness. And in fact, Martin Seligman himself, the person who really kicked off this whole positive psychology movement, has written about learned helplessness. So there's a lot in that. But for today, I'm going to try and rein it in a little bit and say simply, external locus of control, things happen to us. An internal locus of control, we believe that we have, at least in part, the ability to change those things around us. If we didn't, we probably wouldn't set a goal. If we didn't, we'd probably give up before we started, or give up early on. If we didn't, we would probably have no sense of really being able to attain anything. And of course, that's not a great place and space to be in. You may at this juncture be thinking, well, hold on a second. If that is the case, if that's true, then couldn't it be that we can get into delusional thinking if somebody says, yeah, I can control everything? Absolutely, and that's why we have those safeguards in place to consider whether we or others are in fact being delusional. And so it's not like that. It's more this sense of, yeah, I believe that I can do something. I believe that I have the resources. If I don't have the resources, I can go and find them. And that when I do something and it doesn't work out, well, yeah, it may have been external factors, of course. The key is that we in that situation would believe that we can find a way to overcome what has just happened. And once more in there, you can see how that would relate potentially to resilience, to perseverance. Of course, these things tend to be connected, which is why there's more than one video, which is why I tend to scatter some of the ideas around, hoping that it, at least if it's not overt, that subconsciously somewhere or covertly there is a sense that, hold on a second, I can see how these things may be connected. Right, that's giving me an idea. I should explore that area in relation to this. So it's probably going to be a heck of a mind map to jot it all down, but it could also be a worthwhile exercise. For the moment, without the mind map, these things are connected. And so we have this explanatory style, so-called. Do we believe that everything happens to us by chance and we're buffeted around? Or do we believe that we have, at least in part, some sense of agency in our lives, a confidence that we can make change, that we can look at a blank wall and say, well, you know, yeah, I think I can paint that. I think I can do something to give that a different colour. I'm using perhaps a simplified and slightly daft example to make the point, but I think it is important to make that point because I'm not suggesting that any of us, as I've already mentioned, should get into delusional thinking. And I'm not suggesting that things don't happen to us. Of course they do. But the internal locus of control individual will be saying to themselves, okay, so it's happened, how do I overcome it? Because I have this sense of agency and a belief that I can change things in my environment. Too extreme can become delusional. If we are the other way, where everything is external and we just believe we can't control anything, then we give up. And that's that sense of hopelessness and living without hope, far less optimism, but including pessimism in the mix, is dangerous for anyone. You can imagine that that is a fairly tortuous place to exist within. And I think it's important to mention also that when I'm talking about optimism and talking about some of these ideas and strategies in this initial canter over the subject, it is important to recognize once more, and I know I've said it before, but for the sake of making sure that the message is not missed, if you're struggling, if you know someone else who's struggling, then at least speak to a friend. But if at all possible, and if it is that kind of situation, seek professional help, which hopefully you can get. Anyway, so we've got this idea of attributional style. The other thing that, again, in terms of a quick snapshot about optimism that can help orientate us towards it and away from pessimism, is something called the 3 Ps. Again, this is from Martin Seligman. And the 3 Ps are sometimes called cognitive distortions. And let me explain what they are and explain why they can be called that. So number one, in terms of the 3 Ps, is pessimism. It's not, it is not pessimism. Number one is that this describes a pessimistic thinking style. So the 3 Ps are personal, pervasive, and permanent. So personal, pervasive, and permanent. So when we're in a pessimistic 3P thinking style or cognitive distortion, then, well, let's imagine that you decide to invite some people over for dinner and you decide to cook and you burn the food. Or you burn, let's make it even more simple, one of the meals. So you burn one of the meals and people have turned up and you've decided to follow this recipe exactly, and you follow it, and lo and behold, it's pretty singed. And maybe you decide to give it to people and you just know it's not quite right, or you decide to put it in the bin. But you feel embarrassment and you may feel you've let everyone down. So let's run that through the pessimistic 3 Ps. So remember, personal, pervasive, permanent. So personal, we can tell ourselves in that situation, not I made a mistake with the cooking, I am a terrible cook. We can extend that and personalize it, but for the moment, let's say we call ourselves a terrible cook. If we're more optimistic, we could say, "Hey, I burnt that meal." Maybe even laugh at it. I made a bit of a mistake. I followed the recipe exactly, but this is an embarrassment. Can someone open the windows before the smoke detectors go off? But in pessimistic 3P territory, I have let everyone down. I have failed. I'm a terrible cook. I'm a bad person. So that's the personal part. Then the pervasive part of 3P pessimism. When it's pervasive, we can begin to believe that this has impacted or is there in all sorts of areas in our lives. So it could be not only, well, I feel bad, I'm bad at cooking, I'm a terrible cook. I'm actually bad as a friend. I'm bad as a host to these people. I'm bad as someone who could and should be able to organize these events. I simply can't. I failed as a colleague because some of these people were my colleague. And this can drift out and out and out and out in the pessimistic 3P. Personal, I'm an awful cook, I'm a bad person. Pervasive, then everything in my life is a mess. Everything's equivalent to this burnt meal. This is how everything turns out. This is what I do in relationships. This is what I do in work. This is what I do when I get a promotion. I screw it up. I burn the meal, so to speak. And then the third part of the pessimism version of 3P, the permanent part. Well, what can we do? We can say to ourselves, and you may have been there, I've certainly been there, that this is just awful and it's going to be like this forever. I just will screw things up for as long as I'm around. I will screw things up all the time. I will never get that promotion. If I get the promotion, I will metaphorically burn the meal. I will make mistake after mistake after mistake. and I will never be able to host an event. I'll never be a good colleague or a decent friend, because not only am I a bad cook, I'm a bad person. It's in every area of my life, and this is going to go on forever. Now, once more, you may be thinking, well, yeah, that's a bit exaggerated. Is it though? Maybe you've been there. I've been there. There are times when our thinking can go into the 3P, pessimistic mode, and we can think along those lines. We take something, the personalizing it, some people have suggested it's a little bit like catastrophizing as well, and I think that's true. It's emotional type thinking. It's not logical, but you can see why we're hurt in that moment. And so we personalize it, we begin to say that we're all bad, and then the pervasive part, every element of our lives is bad, and we're the center of making it bad, and then it will go on forever. So what is the flip side? Well, I've already sort of touched on that to a degree. First of all, we depersonalize it. It's a meal. We burnt the meal. We followed the recipe. Maybe we can have a laugh at it. If these are good friends and colleagues, they should be able to help us. What about the pervasive part? Well, again, what about all the other things that we do well in our lives? What about those things that we're successful at and have been? Easy to forget about them when the going is tough, when we're in that emotional quagmire. Really easy to forget about it. And what about the idea of it being permanent? Well, nothing in life is. Now, we know that logically, although we sometimes like to ignore it, but nothing is. You know, think of all the trends that come and go so quickly. The memes, the jokes, the TV programs that are like red hot, wonderful, the movies, and then gradually there's another movie comes along, fashion, and of course even friendships. Partly because of distance, because of time, because we're busy, but the individual that we think, well, we'll do this every day, this will never change, and it does. And maybe something changes in our lives, positive or negative, and maybe something changes in that other individual's lives. We know this. We know it isn't permanent. When we're in that kind of all or nothing, black and white emotional thinking, then it can seem permanent. It can feel as if it will go on forever. So the 3 Ps, as I was starting to say at the beginning, the fourth P is not pessimism. That's one version of 3 Ps. So pessimism, personal, we take it personally. It's pervasive, everything in our lives, bad, and it's permanent, it'll go on forever. The optimistic, or the more optimistic version of the 3 Ps, well, it's not. It's something that we did. It was an event. It was a situation. It was outside us. It isn't us. The meal was burnt. We followed the recipe, or we forgot to follow the recipe. It's a thing. It's a mistake. It's external. We need to not internalize it. We need to externalize it. And then pervasive, no, this is absolute nonsense. We can quite categorically disprove that and dispute it logically, and maybe sometimes we need a friend to help us to do that, by the way. That's an important part in the mix for all of us, well, for many of us, from time to time. And then, is it permanent? Well, no. We can look at our lives so far and think of all the things that have been impermanent. So it's not going to be. But once more, in the middle of that event, that situation, I, for sure, can be in the 3P pessimistic mode, and it can take a little bit of time to come out of it. And probably that's one of the keys. It's not that we won't necessarily go there, but it's how quickly we can get out of it. Because if we don't get out of it quickly enough, whatever quickly enough may mean to each of us individually, then it can become a habit, and it can become a way that we continue to think, and we start to look at other things in that same way, and it's a bit of a pile-on, which is why I think it's important to, in my opinion, to speak to some trusted friends, if at all possible, friends and colleagues. But also we can see, again, thinking about how things are connected, that exercise could be important, laughter, humor could be important, and also getting in nature or looking at it could be important, and so on. So then we get on to this this final part, which is in part this overview, this quick overview of optimism and how we can, I suppose, guard against pessimism more readily, which is probably a better way to frame things rather than to say, hey, this is going to make you extremely happy, because that can be one version of what optimism means to some people. For me, it's more about guarding against pessimism, but that's a personal opinion. So you may have heard of the sort of ABC exercise. You may have heard of some types of therapy like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and they use a version of this. And again, Martin Seligman talks about it. So ABC can be sometimes the A is the antecedent, the activator, the activity, and for some people it can be, I suppose, a trigger would be one way to consider it, or something that's adversarial. So it's what can activate it, the antecedent, the thing that came before the C part of ABC, which we'll come on to. And so we have this trigger, if I use that language. Then we have, it could be our behaviors, how we react to whatever has happened, or it could be our belief and behavior. Very often belief has been in the mix. Can't say it's always there, but it either has been there or is there. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then we have the outcome or the consequence. So we have this antecedent, this activator, this trigger. We have this behavior, belief, behavior and belief, and we have the consequence, the output from that thing happening and how we acted to give us that consequence. And within the action, as I've mentioned very often, is or are our beliefs. So let's I'll give you a simple example. Let's say that you walk into the office in the morning and you look across and Jenny is there behind her desk and it's like open plan, and you wave across and you say, "Hi, good morning, Jenny." And she ignores you. It just blanks you. And you think, oh, you sort of do a half faint-hearted smile, but don't want to overdo it. And suddenly you think, oh, that feels a bit awkward. That feels a bit bad. She was looking straight at me. I'm sure she can see me. What the heck could have been going on there? And you sit down, and now, of course, this is an example. In real life, maybe you went across and said, "Are you okay?" or whatever. But to stick with our example, you, me, in this example, we sit down and we ruminate a bit about this and think, maybe we run through some of the conversations that we've had with Jenny over the last day or two. Oh, I wonder if it's when I said about her husband's new car. Maybe I've offended them. Or maybe it's when I decided to go to the photocopier earlier rather than wait until 10 o'clock, which is normally the time that I go. In other words, you start to wonder about that stuff. And again, in terms of that ABC territory, it's very often the case that we have to find ways to rationalize, but it could be that rationalization is negative. And so the consequence in that situation, so our belief is we've done something wrong, or our belief is we've been snubbed. Could be both, I suppose, but those are just examples. And the consequence of that is that, well, if we've done something wrong, we may want to hide, we might not want to talk, we feel miserable. If we feel we've been snubbed, we're embarrassed, we want to sit a bit smaller in the office, we want the ground to swallow us up, and so on. So of course there are trillions and billions and an unlimited number of examples that we could give, and maybe that you've had, and certainly I've had, around this sort of ABC thing. But I've certainly had situations where something's happened, I've had a belief about it, and that belief has changed how I have been feeling. And so, just to pick up on the behavior, in case I'm not making that clear enough. So the trigger, this antecedent event to the consequence, the trigger is me saying hi to Jenny and her ignoring. And then the belief is that, well, I've been snubbed, I've done something wrong. And of course, importantly, there's a feeling attached to that. And that feeling could be embarrassment, it might be irritation, it might be just feeling aghast about things. And the consequences are, maybe I don't speak to Jenny, maybe I avoid, maybe I just want to leave the office for the day, and so on. Again, you can see that could spin off into many different multiverses in terms of how things could pan out. And maybe that's not a bad way to think about this example. So I'm going to stick to one universe and one throughput. And of course, as you may already know, or certainly have guessed, then what we're looking at there is to challenge, a disputation is sometimes called, to dispute what we're telling ourselves about it, is one road in to say, hold on a second, you're feeling miserable, and the outcome, the consequences of what you were saying and doing there is that you've sort of ostracized yourself from everyone else. Or indeed, the consequence could be that the next time you see Jenny, you're abrupt with her. And she's going, well, what's going on? And then that starts to spiral way out of control. And I've seen things like that happen. It's probably another story for another time, when people's beliefs get tampered with. But let's stick to this. So let's you and I then consider other options about what could have gone on with Jenny in that situation, or with us in that situation. So we walk in the morning and Jenny is looking at us, or so we think, and we say good morning and we're ignored. So this is the activity, this is the trigger, this is the antecedent, this is what has caused us ultimately the consequence of feeling terrible, believing that we're rubbish, wanting to go home, whatever. Is that what happened, or is it an interpretation? Were we snubbed? So what different things could have been going on? And I would suggest that, well, number one, Jenny may have been listening to something and we weren't aware of it. She may have been so deep in thought. It could have been a phone call. It could have been something like a podcast, and for some reason she was able to work and do that little bit of multiplexing to listen to it and was daydreaming. Maybe simply she was daydreaming. Maybe Jenny had had some bad news. Maybe Jenny had had some good news. Because, you know, there are occasions when people can appear to be looking at us, but they're not. They're much more internal in their own world at that point in time. And if in the past, there's no reason to have suspected that Jenny would have cause to snub us, what's more likely? And also, if we then, when this belief is disputed and we can open it up a little bit and shine some sunlight on it, we might then begin to think, oh yeah, hold on a second, she does listen to podcasts, or she was waiting on news about XYZ. Or indeed, yeah, they've got this new dictation set up and everybody hates it, but you've got to listen to it online and type out certain things. If you chaired the meeting, it's your job, whatever. And so we can begin to then change not only what is a potential habit in terms of attributional style using that strategy, we can also potentially be able to look at our own biases and habits in terms of cognitive distortions, because perhaps one of our habits is to say pessimistically, it's something I've done. You know, here we go again, the world does this to me, and I'm going to personalize it. So I've immediately personalized it in terms of the pessimistic 3P version that I talked about. And I've definitely got a habit of doing that. My first port of call would probably in that situation have been to say to myself, oh my gosh, what have I done? Oh, I feel bad. And to think about those things. And I come back to sometimes that's when it's important to borrow someone else's brain, to get that opinion from someone who's stepped back a little bit from it. Why? Because they've got distance, because it didn't happen to them. Things aren't as visceral for them. They're not being pulled into that potential quagmire emotionally. I'm going to end, if you are still here, thank you very much for going along with this little ride. I'm going to end, not at this moment, but I'm going to end in 5 minutes probably. And before I do that, what I want to do is, I'm just making sure there's no sound suddenly comes off that. What I want to do is to give you a real life version, to tell you a real life story, which I think illustrates this ABC thing, and also how we can jump to conclusions in terms of our attributional style, and how we can also personalize stuff. So a few years ago, I was in London, and I was at a meeting, and it was a planning meeting, and I hadn't been that well, and people wanted to, it was a cold or the flu or something, and I had to go along for a bit of a meal after an event, and there was wine on offer, and I really didn't have any because I didn't feel that great, but I took a few sips. At most I had like, you know, a third of a glass at most. And the company was putting me up in a hotel. So what I did was I headed to that hotel, didn't stay late. And I walked in, and there was a guy from the same organization, but a different part of it, who was in from the States. And he was with a colleague. And I said, oh, hi, in the foyer of the hotel. Hi, Bob, how are you doing? I'll call him Bob because that was his name. And he went, oh, and he seemed a bit off, a bit blunt with me. And I did my best social interaction persona that I could, because again I was feeling a bit rough and I was feeling a bit tired, but hey, you doing here? And I was doing this across the road, different part of the organization, and you guys are here, what a coincidence. And this is your colleague. Oh yeah, okay, we're really pleased to meet you, and you got out for some food, how was your flight, blah 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 blah. And I thought I was being like the perfect welcome to London guide. And he just listened kind of blankly and grunted a few times. And as I was sort of halfway through a sentence, something along the lines of, well, do you know I can recommend a restaurant, which is, he went, yeah, good night. And I reflexively put my hand up and shook his hand. And he walked away with his colleague. And I thought, oh, wow. Oh, right, okay. Now, in that moment, I felt really bad because I thought I was trying to be sociable. I was a bit tired myself, but I wanted to be pleasant and greet this individual. I didn't know them that well. I hadn't met his colleague before. And I just thought, oh my gosh, maybe it's because I had that cold flu kind of thing. Maybe they smell alcohol and thought I was drunk. Maybe I was over talking again. Maybe I was saying too much. Maybe I was overly enthusiastic. And I spent days revisiting, not every second of every day, but when I thought about it, I kind of went, oh no, what did I do? Will you ever learn to just keep quiet, to shut up? you're probably asking the same question. Will he ever shut up? Soon, I promise. So I was knocked sideways by that. I mean, there's a lot more to it than it comes across in the translation. Live, in the moment, all I can say is that it was hurtful, and I felt really bad. And I felt bad for the people because I thought, I've obviously been prattling on. Now, there we have a kind of ABC thing. So we've got the event, the antecedent, the trigger, which was the initial conversation, and then this person snubbing in the middle of it, in mid-flow. And if that's ever happened to you, you know that's weird at best, and it is a bit, oh, startling. What have I said? And then we had the belief. So the belief was, I have really, really, really upset those people. I have totally overstepped the mark. I've been way too enthusiastic or something. My social skills suck. And once more, that proves it to me. Consequences, you know, not quite lying in a darkened room, but genuinely beginning to rethink how I interact with people. And I do think about how I interact with people, because I know I don't always get it right. Sometimes it's better than it's not. But the reason I think about this stuff is because I want people to at least walk away feeling neutral. I don't like to offend. I don't like arguments. I like to avoid them if possible, but you can't always avoid them. And certainly I'd rather, particularly these days, that people walked away feeling a bit better than a bit worse. I don't want to be an energy vampire, that's for sure. So yeah, a bit crushed, damp towel in a darkened room kind of thing. Again, not quite. And then a chance phone call with someone I'm still in contact with, who's English. She works in the States, and we just got on a conversation, and I didn't say what had happened to her. She was in the same business but a different part, but knew this individual, and she said, now, by the way, let me pause and let me get you to think about what you think might have been going on. So you don't have to say anything out loud. Just have a think about what you think might have been going on. Presuming, of course, that I'm always the perfect guest. Yeah, I should get a job. Welcome to London. No, I'm not. I could have been screwing that up, and maybe to a degree I was, but there was something else in the mix. So this individual, she said, oh, Bob, yeah, he's what was it she said? He's about as emotionally intelligent as a house brick, or, you know, words to that effect, with maybe some other flowery language in there. And I said, oh, really? She said, no, yeah, he's renowned for it. Absolutely. Highly skilled individual, but my goodness, what a blunt person he is to be around, and says things and doesn't seem to care. And I thought, okay. Now, when I asked you to think about what may have been happening, you may have been also potentially thinking about something else. And it wasn't from this individual that I found that out. It was actually about a month later when someone else said, oh, you know, by the way, Bob is having an affair with so-and-so. Then the penny dropped. I was in a situation where he wasn't expecting anybody to be there from the business, even a different part of it. And I'd been working across this business in different areas, and he wasn't expecting anybody to be there at that time of night. And he wasn't expecting to get such an effusive welcome to London when he was trying to be discreet with his lady friend. And I thought, right, okay, yeah, he is a bit blunt, that is true, but it definitely explains what was going on there. Did that mean I was absolutely perfect. Absolutely not. I could still have been boring them both. I could still have been overly enthusiastic. All that may still be true. But in the mix, and the thing that changes my belief about the situation and then changes how I feel, was that extra information. Will we always get that extra piece of information? No, absolutely not. So when we dispute things in terms of our belief, which could have driven behavior and consequence, when we dispute it, it's in a sense to have reasonable doubt. Kind of that thing. To say, could it have been? And if we are doubtful enough that our initial interpretation was wrong, then those feelings of embarrassment, of cringe, of having done something wrong, etc., they can diminish. And over time, of course, dissipate. So yeah, there we are. Good old Bob. And that was, it's a true story. It's an absolutely true story. And I was gobsmacked. And thought, yeah, be aware of beating yourself up about stuff and drifting into some pessimism and getting into that 3P thinking. So to finish that off, that's also where I was, because I'd personalized it. It was all about me. I had made it pervasive. You know, I do tend to screw things up. And was I even remotely coherent when I was at the meal before I met that guy? And what about last week? What about last month? And permanent? Yeah. No matter what I seem to do, I seem to be able to screw those situations up in a big way. And yet that was pretty much not true. Doesn't mean to say I'm perfect in any of that by any stretch of the imagination. But in that situation, it was not true. Or at least there was something else in the mix which more likely explained the behaviors. Anyway, oh my goodness, 46, almost 47 minutes. So we should bring things to a close. If you've been there for a little while, we've been popping in and out, or even from the beginning, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you found that useful. As I've said, it's a companion piece to the earlier video about Perma, and also it is part of a continued dialogue and hopefully conversation that I want to keep going as we both learn. We all learn as we go along. Anyway, all I've got to find out now is how to switch this thing off again. Back to some potential 3P beating yourself up thinking. So I think maybe there. Yeah, want to stop streaming? Yes, I do. So thank you very much, everyone. Bye for now.